I've got two black children, twin boys aged 19. And so Laura Tingle's assertion that Australia is a racist country became something of a talking point around our dinner table over the weekend. Now, I've always taught my sons that the only thing worse than racism is imagined racism. Actual racism, well, that can be confronted and dealt with. I remember one of my boys coming home from primary school and telling me another kid had called him a piece of poo because he was brown. I asked my son, well, what did you say? He smiled and said he'd replied the other boy must be bird poo since he was white. Racism dealt with. But imagined racism, where racist undertones are presumed in every interaction, well, that's a bondage from which you can never be freed, since the chains exist entirely in your own mind. It was for that reason I found ABC political reporter and board member Laura Tingle's comments concerning.
We are a racist country, let's face it, we always have been, and it's very depressing, but to give a licence like that I find profoundly depressing and a terrible prospect for the next election.
Now, the last thing I want for my sons is for them to believe that Australia is and always has been a racist country. Just because Laura Tingle is depressed doesn't mean my kids should be. If my boys buy into this idea that Australia is an inherently racist country, well, they're going to start imagining racists lurking in every social group, and they'll be tempted to think racism was the reason they weren't awarded a free kick in their football game at the weekend. The result will be that my beautiful boys are turned into perpetual victims when, in actual fact, they live in one of the most generous, gracious countries on earth. One of the first things this Labor government did when assuming office was to propose a code of conduct for politicians. Now, Federal Minister for Early Childhood Education and Youth, Anne Ali, insisted the code of conduct should focus on racism and microaggressions towards people of colour. In a submission to the committee charged with creating the code for parliamentarians and staff, she wrote, "I have witnessed instances of subtle racism and microaggressions towards people of colour in Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces and have experienced them myself." Notice Ali didn't complain of racism, but of subtle racism. And she didn't allege aggression towards people of colour. She claimed rather to be aware of microaggressions. Now, I would have thought that was cause for celebration. Whatever aggression did exist towards people of colour in parliamentary workplaces, it was evidently micro, so subtle as to be barely perceptible. That is, after all, the definition of a racist microaggression. It's an act of racism so infinitesimal that you must look very hard to find it before you can claim to have been traumatised by it. Incidentally, I'd suggest that if parliamentary staff have time to inspect every interaction so carefully to work out whether or not they're offended by it, they probably have too much time on their hands. Now, Ali's submission continued, "No code of conduct that seeks to change workplace culture would be complete without acknowledging that these behaviours, microaggressions, exist in our workplace." Well, the MP was right that acknowledging microaggressions would change workplace culture, but maybe not in the way she thinks, and certainly not for the better. Focusing on subtle racism and microaggressions only trains people to pore over the minutiae of every conversation and to sift through the entrails of every interaction in search of hidden racism. It prepares a small group of people to always be ready to take offence, and it trains everybody else to go through life always fearful of giving offence. As a result, everyone is worse off, though nothing's actually happened. If my adopted Ethiopian sons end up working in Parliament, God forbid, no one will ask them where they're from for fear that what they'll hear is, well, because I'm black, I can't be Australian. Subtle, isn't it? And so no one will ask them where they're from, and they'll assume it's because people aren't interested in them because of their colour. Aha, a microaggression. See how this works? Talk of microaggressions reduces staff to micro people incapable of ever being normal thanks to the all-seeing microscope of race-obsessed micro managers. And so everyone is made smaller by the experience. Well, everyone that is, except for the ever-expanding team of consultants required to train staff to spot subtle racism and microaggressions, since they are so subtle and so microscopic they can only be seen with the aid of taxpayer-funded training. I told my son one night a while ago that it was time to turn off the TV and go to bed. Straight-faced, he looked at me, he said, "Why? Because I'm black? Is this a racial thing?" And then a smirk slowly formed across his face and we both burst out laughing before he chuffed off to bed. So-called microaggressions are harmful to my son, but only because he might split his sides from laughter. If racism is imagined in every conversation and presumed to be embedded in every interaction, then people will imagine themselves always as victims, even when they're not. And that is worse than racism, since there's no remedy for that. So I'm pleading with the Laura Tingles and the Anne Arleys of this world, please, you don't protect my black children from racism by exaggerating racism. Are there instances of racism in Australia? Well, of course, as in every country. But is Australia an inherently racist country? Of course not. Actual racism can be called out and dealt with. But imagined racism, if bought into, becomes a massive chip on the shoulder that once established is almost impossible to remove. And I really don't want that for my kids.